Çatalhöyük's rooftop world. A dense, maze-like town with rooftop streets and wall-painted rooms slowly emptied, as if its close-packed way of life simply became unbearable. A cool Anatolian wind brushes across the sun-baked plains of central Turkey, stirring dust on a low, sprawling mound that looks, to the untrained eye, like just another hill. Beneath this earthy blanket, however, lies not a natural formation, but a silent architectural revolution, a vast, Neolithic honeycomb of mud brick homes so tightly packed that there were no streets, lanes, or alleys. For centuries, the only pathways here were across rooftops, and the only doorways were holes in the ceiling, reached by ladders from below. This is Çatalhöyük. Around 9,000 years ago, it was one of the world's first and largest known proto-cities, a bustling hive of perhaps 8,000 souls. But its story does not end in a dramatic conquest or a sudden cataclysm. Instead, over generations, this remarkably innovative way of living was simply walked away from. The ladders were pulled up, the roof holes sealed, and the community dispersed, leaving a profound puzzle for modern archaeology. What causes a society to voluntarily abandon a system it perfected over a millennium? To understand Çatalhöyük is to step into a world of profound intimacy and startling practicality. Imagine a community where your neighbor's wall is your wall, where privacy was a concept defined very differently. The settlement grew not outwards, but inwards and upwards. When a family needed a new home, they often built it directly on top of the collapsed remains of an old one, bricking over the past. This created the telltale archaeological tell, a mound-built layer by human layer. Movement was a vertical and communal affair. People climbed from their dark, plastered living quarters onto a shared rooftop landscape, a realm of social interaction, work, and travel. Down below, the homes were small, square, and single-roomed, but they were rich canvases. Their walls were continually replastered and painted with elaborate murals, geometric patterns, handprints, and vivid scenes of hunting, with wild bulls and deer rendered in striking red ochre. Beneath the floors, the bodies of the deceased were carefully buried, often curled in a fetal position, binding the cycle of life and death directly into the fabric of the home. The mainstream anchor of Çatalhöyük is undeniable. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, celebrated as a pivotal window into the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled farming. Excavations, most notably those led by British archaeologist James Mellor-Art in the 1960 seconds, and later by Ian Hodder from 1993 onwards, have revealed a society with a surprisingly egalitarian structure. There is no evidence of a ruler's palace, no central temple, no grand storehouses indicating a powerful elite hoarding wealth. The economy was based on agriculture and the herding of sheep and cattle, but also on the hunting of wild aurochs, whose powerful symbolism permeates the art. This was a society that seemed to thrive on a collective, face-to-face existence for hundreds of years. Yet, within this well-documented framework, lie curious, fringe-adjacent details that resist easy explanation. Among the most haunting are the so-called history houses. These are particular dwellings, rebuilt in the exact same location over many generations, that contain a disproportionate number of burials and an unusual concentration of symbolic items. Bull horns embedded in benches, figurines, and collections of animal parts. They suggest a form of ancestral veneration, a ritual continuity that passed through specific houses rather than a separate priestly class. Even more enigmatic are the occasional findings of what appear to be deliberate, almost ritualistic closure of houses. Before abandoning a dwelling, inhabitants sometimes seem to have scoured it clean, removed useful items, and then deliberately collapsed the roof or filled it with clean soil. It was a gentle entombment, a careful closing of a chapter, not a frantic escape. Scholars still debate whether the ultimate cause of Çatalhöyük's abandonment was environmental, social, or a slow-bleeding combination of both. Climate data suggests the region may have become drier, putting pressure on agriculture, but the social answer may be more profound. The very density that defined Çatalhöyük, the lack of streets, the constant proximity, the complex web of obligations and interactions conducted on rooftops and in dark, shared rooms, may have seeded its own end. In a lesser-known but fascinating theory, some anthropologists point to the evidence of rising social stress. Analysis of human remains shows an increase in interpersonal violence over time. Bones bear the marks of blows and projectile points. The wall paintings themselves may tell a story of a changing relationship with the wild. The early vibrant hunting scenes give way, in the upper layers, to more static, repetitive patterns. Was the world outside becoming less abundant, or was the world inside becoming too intense? The abandonment was not a single event, but a gradual migration. People likely drifted to smaller, more spread-out satellite villages where they could have more space, more private courtyards, and perhaps a less suffocatingly communal existence. They took their knowledge, their culture, and their genes with them. They did not vanish. They chose a different pattern. The sealed rooms and carefully buried houses of Çatalhöyük stand as a monumental experiment in ultra-communal living. Its people mastered an incredible architectural solution to a settled life, but in the end, they may have found that the solution created a new kind of problem, a problem of too much togetherness. As we will see, this theme of a society being subtly undone by the very structures that once made it strong is a quiet echo that will resurface in other, very different, vanished worlds. The lost Cycladic islanders, marble figurines and seaside settlements hint at a graceful Aegean culture that dimmed just before the age of palaces and written records. The deep blue of the Aegean Sea, under a relentless sun, does more than separate islands. It preserves secrets in its dry, rocky soil. Centuries before the rise of the great Minoan palaces on Crete, a different kind of culture flourished across the scattered archipelagos of the Cyclades. These were not builders of vast complexes, but sculptors of stunning simplicity. Their most enduring legacy is a silent army of marble. Slender, elegant figurines, mostly female, with folded arms, subtly curved bodies, and featureless faces, save for a prominent, elongated nose. To stand before one today, in the cool silence of a museum, is to feel a profound sense of calm and immense distance. These objects seem to distill an entire worldview into pure, abstract form. Yet, the people who carved them, who traded them across the sea lanes, who buried them with their dead, faded from prominence so completely that they became a ghostly prelude to the better-known Bronze Age. Their vibrant, maritime way of life dimmed, leaving behind art of timeless beauty and a historical narrative full of silent gaps. The mainstream anchor for the Cycladic civilization is firmly established through its material culture, dating from approximately 3,200 to 2000 BCE. The islands, such as Naxos, Paros, and Keros, were dotted with small coastal settlements. These communities were master mariners and traders, part of a network that connected mainland Greece, Anatolia, and Crete. Their economy was based on fishing, herding, and the cultivation of olives and grapes, a classic Aegean package. They also possessed sophisticated metallurgical skills, working with silver, lead, and copper. The settlement of Daskalio, a small islet now linked by a narrow strip to the island of Keros, provides a fascinating glimpse. What was once thought to be a mere cemetery is now understood, through extensive excavations, as a major ritual center. Vast quantities of broken marble figurines and vessels were deliberately brought here and deposited, suggesting the site served as a sacred destination for generations of islanders, a place where objects were ceremonially retired. The curious and often troubling detail of Cycladic history lies in the modern fate of their art. The stark beauty of the figurines made them irresistible to 20th century artists like Picasso and Modigliani, who saw in them a kindred modernist spirit. This adoration, however, fueled an epidemic of looting. For decades, tomb robbers ravaged Cycladic cemeteries to feed the illicit antiquities market. The vast majority of the thousands of known figurines have no recorded archaeological context. They were ripped from their graves, their companions, the pottery, the tools, the other burial goods discarded or lost. This has created a profound disconnect. We have the sublime art, but we have lost the story it was meant to tell. Archaeologists are thus forced to reconstruct a religion, a social structure, and a funerary practice from artifacts that are essentially orphans, their original meaning obscured. Some scholars cautiously note that a few figurines show evidence of having been painted with eyes and other details, a fact that radically changes their austere appearance, hinting at a more colourful and expressive worldview now almost entirely faded. Scholars still debate whether these figurines represent goddesses, ancestor spirits, or idealized mortals. The folded arm position is almost universal, but its significance is locked away. Even more pressing is the mystery of their decline. There was no single, violent invasion that wiped out the Cycladic islanders. Instead, their distinctive cultural fingerprint, the specific style of their pottery, their metalwork, and the production of their iconic figurines slowly disappears from the archaeological record. The prevailing theory points to the gravitational pull of rising powers. As the Minoan civilization on Crete began its golden age, constructing labyrinthine palaces and establishing a formidable maritime trade network, the Cycladic islands were drawn into its orbit. They became way stations, perhaps even tributaries, in a new economic and political order. The old ways, the local artistic traditions, may have simply become less relevant, absorbed or replaced by Minoan styles and goods. It was a cultural fade, not a catastrophic collapse. This absorption hints at a quieter, more pervasive form of vanishing. The Cycladic people did not die out. Their genes and their descendants undoubtedly lived on. But their unique cultural identity, their specific way of encoding beliefs in marble, was smoothed over by the currents of a changing world. The ritual depositions on Keros ceased. The quarries on Naxos that produced the pristine marble likely continued to operate, but perhaps for new masters with different aesthetic demands. The seafaring knowledge of the islanders was probably incorporated into the growing Minoan thalassocracy. Their vanishing is akin to a distinct dialect being subsumed by a dominant language. They became the foundation upon which something else was built, their own story relegated to prehistory. As we will see, this pattern of a vibrant culture being overshadowed and conceptually erased by its more famous successors is a recurring theme, one that asks us to look not just for evidence of catastrophe, but for the subtle archaeology of forgetting. The vanished Elamite courts, an ancient rival to Mesopotamia's empires, left layered capitals and cryptic inscriptions before its political heartland dissolved into successor states. To the east of the storied Tigris and Euphrates, beyond the alluvial plains that nurtured Sumer and Babylon, the landscape rises into the rugged, sun-scorched folds of the Zagros Mountains and spills out into a harsh, fertile plain. This is the land of Elam, a name that resonated for millennia in Mesopotamian royal inscriptions, usually as that of a formidable perennial rival. For over 2,000 years, the Elamites constructed their own sophisticated civilization, one that oscillated between brilliant, centralized power and fragmented, mountain-based resistance. Their story is told in the ruins of layered capitals like Susa, a city that endured as a great administrative center for countless empires, and in the enigmatic script they left behind. Yet, the final chapter of Elam, as an independent, cohesive political force, ends not with a bang heard around the ancient world, but with a slow dissolution, its heartland gradually becoming a prized province for others, until its very name faded from political use. The mainstream historical anchor for Elam is inextricably tied to its great lowland capital, Susa. This city, in what is now southwestern Iran, provides a near-continuous archaeological record from at least 4000 BCE. Susa was a gateway and a battleground, a city that was profoundly Elamite, yet constantly interacting with and being conquered by its Mesopotamian neighbors. The famed law code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, was actually discovered not in Babylon, but at Susa, likely taken as war booty by an Elamite king centuries after it was written. This single artifact symbolizes the dynamic, constant cultural and military exchange. Elamite society was a complex federation, often described as a triple alliance of three regions: the coastal plain, the Midlands, and the high mountains. At its height, under kings like Untash-Naparisha, who built the magnificent ziggurat complex at Chogha-Zanbil, Elam could project immense power. This uncanny brick structure, dedicated to the god Inshushinak, stands as one of the best preserved ziggurats in the world, a testament to Elamite architectural ambition and religious devotion distinct from, yet conversant with, Mesopotamian styles. One lesser-known curious facet of Elamite culture lies in its unique and persistent royal succession. For long periods, Elam followed a system of appanage, where inheritance did not simply pass from father to son, but was shared between dynastic lines in a way that prioritized the sister's son, a form of matrilineal emphasis rare in the ancient Near East. This created a complex, often unstable political structure with multiple co-rulers and shifting power bases between Susa in the lowlands and Anshan in the highlands. Furthermore, their script, known as Elamite cuneiform, remains a significant challenge. While it uses the wedge-shaped writing borrowed from Mesopotamia, it records a language isolate unrelated to Sumerian or Akkadian. Thousands of tablets, particularly from administrative archives, are still only partially understood. This linguistic veil means we hear the Elamite state largely through its bureaucratic receipts and the often hostile propaganda of its enemies, making the recovery of its own internal voice, its literature and worldview, a painstaking, incomplete task. Scholars still debate whether the final blow to Elamite political independence came from external assault or internal fragmentation. The traditional narrative points to the devastating campaign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. Assyrian annals and palace reliefs boast graphically of the total destruction of Susa. They show royal tombs desecrated, statues of gods smashed, and salt sown in the earth. I devastated the provinces of Elam, and on their lands I sowed salt, Ashurbanipal proclaims. This was meant to be a scorched earth finale. Yet, the archaeological record at Susa suggests a more nuanced story. While there was indeed massive destruction, life did not cease. The city was rebuilt, but it was no longer the capital of an independent Elam. Instead, the political and cultural heart of Elam seems to have already been shifting, or perhaps retreating, to its highland base at Anshan in the centuries before the Assyrian onslaught. The federation was weakening from within. The true vanishing of Elam, then, was a process of absorption and redefinition. After the Assyrian destruction, the region was incorporated into the Neo-Babylonian and then the meteoric Achaemenid Persian Empire. Crucially, the Achaemenid kings, like Cyrus the Great, originated from the region of Anshan. They were, in a sense, the heirs to the highland Elamite tradition. Susa became one of the glittering capitals of the Persian Empire, its halls filled not with Elamite princes, but with satraps and tribute-bearers from across the known world. The Elamite language persisted in administration for a time, but was eventually supplanted by Aramaic. The distinct political identity of Elam melted away, its components repurposed for a new, global order. Its people did not disappear. They became Persians. Its cities did not crumble. They were reborn under new masters. The civilization vanished not into the sands, but into the foundation stones of an even greater empire, a fate both transformative and final, echoing the quiet cultural submersion witnessed in the Cyclades. but on a grander geopolitical scale. The Zapotec Cloud People, a mountaintop city of tombs, ball courts, and carved glyphs, declined as new powers reshaped the valleys far below its once dominant terraces. The air grows thin and cool as the path winds up the flank of the mountain, leaving the lush, subtropical valley of Oaxaca far below. At an elevation where clouds cling to the peaks, spread across an artificially leveled ridge, lie the ruins of Monte Alban. This was not a city built for convenience or easy access to water. It was a citadel of power and ceremony, conceived and constructed from the bedrock upward, a defiant statement in stone. For over 1,000 years, it was the heart of the Zapotec civilization, the so-called Cloud People. Its grand plaza, ball courts, and elaborate tombs honeycombed into the mountainside speak of a sophisticated society that gazed down upon the world it dominated. Yet, by around 800 CE, the beat of this high-altitude heart began to slow. The monumental constructions ceased. The population dwindled. While Zapotec culture and language endured powerfully in the valleys, their Yunduan capital was gradually, deliberately, left to the elements and the silence, a majestic ghost haunting the summit it once commanded. The mainstream anchor for the Zapotec is unequivocally Monte Alban. Founded around 500 BCE, its very location was a strategic masterstroke. It sits at the confluence of three fertile valleys, a neutral but supremely defensible point that allowed a coalescing elite to project control over a fractious region. The scale of the engineering is staggering. The mountain's summit was literally sheared off and reshaped to create a vast main plaza, flanked by pyramidal platforms, an observatory, and palaces. One of the site's most iconic features is the Gallery of the Danzantes, a collection of over 300 carved stone slabs depicting contorted, often mutilated figures. Long thought to be dancers, they are now widely interpreted as representations of slain enemies or sacrificial victims, a stark record of conquest and power from the city's early, expansionist phase. Furthermore, the Zapotecs were among the earliest in Mesoamerica to develop a hieroglyphic writing and calendrical system, evidence of which is etched into stone markers throughout the site. A curious and lesser-known detail lies not in the grandeur of the main plaza, but in the labyrinth beneath it. The elite of Monte Alban were interred in elaborate, multi-chambered tombs, many of which were designed as underworld palaces, complete with facade-like entrances and interior niches. What is fascinating is the evidence of continued, generations-long veneration. Tombs were not sealed forever. They were re-entered, often multiple times, to place new offerings or to inter additional family members. In some cases, the bones of earlier occupants were respectfully gathered and moved to the side to make room. This speaks to a living relationship with powerful ancestors, who were considered active participants in the fortune of the lineage. Another fringe, but persistent, theory involves the peculiar, upside-down ceramic urns found in some tombs, depicting the wide-eyed rain god Cosijo. Some researchers have cautiously proposed these may relate to rituals for summoning rain or controlling the weather, a critical concern for a city with no natural water source, reliant entirely on intricate systems of cisterns and drainage. Scholars still debate whether the primary cause of Monte Alban's decline was internal social strife, environmental pressure, or the rise of rival powers. There is little evidence of a sudden, catastrophic attack. Instead, the story appears to be one of gradual decentralization. As the city's political and religious authority waned, the noble families who had lived in its precincts may have returned to their ancestral lands in the valley towns, like Zaquila, taking their legitimacy and power bases with them. This was not an abandonment of Zapotec identity, but a retreat from a unified, mountaintop capital to a more diffuse, valley-based network of city-states. Concurrently, new powers were rising. The influence of the great metropolis of Teotihuacan from central Mexico is evident at Monte Alban in earlier centuries. But later, it was the Mixtec peoples, neighbours to the west, who began to exert pressure and eventually moved into the abandoned valleys and even reused Monte Alban's sacred tombs for their own elite burials. The vanishing here is specific. It is the vanishing of a unitary political capital, not the culture itself. The Zapotec language and many cultural traditions thrived in the valley of Oaxaca and continue to this day. But the centralized state that built Monte Alban dissolved. The clouds that once seemed to crown a powerful kingdom were left to swirl around empty platforms. The ball court fell silent, no longer a stage for a ritual that mirrored cosmic conflict and maintained social order. The carefully maintained ancestor tombs were eventually sealed for the last time. The civilization's political heart stopped beating, its energy dissipating back into the regional veins from which it came. As we will see, this theme of a core urban center, emptying as power redistributes to a periphery, is a different kind of disappearance, one less about erasure and more about transformation and return to older, more localized patterns of life. The Wari roadmakers. Before the famous empire of the Andes, planners carved roads and built hilltop complexes that were later reused by others who barely remembered their names. High in the Peruvian Andes, where the air is thin and the landscape is a dramatic tapestry of steep valleys and soaring peaks, the efficiency of movement is not a luxury, it is the bedrock of power. Centuries before the Inca engineered their legendary highway system, another people mastered this rugged terrain. The Wari, emerging around 600 CE from the region of Ayacucho, forged the first true empire in the Andes. They built not with the famous fitted stone of their successors, but with a distinctive, rigid architectural style. Vast, rectangular compounds subdivided into labyrinthine galleries and courtyards, often perched on defensible hilltops. Their greatest tool of control, however, was the road. A network of paths and way stations, etched into mountainsides, connected a far-flung domain. Yet, by 1100 CE, their imperial project unraveled. Their great administrative centres were sealed, their roads fell into disrepair, and their name was all but forgotten, until archaeology began to piece together the story of the precursors who provided the blueprint for Inca glory. The mainstream anchor for the Wari civilization is the archaeological site that bears their name, Wari, near modern Ayacucho. This urban centre, sprawling over several square miles, was a densely populated capital featuring large walled enclosures, ceremonial spaces, and extensive residential areas. It was a planned city, reflecting a top-down, administrative vision. Beyond their heartland, the Wari established provincial centres that are marvels of strategic planning. Piquilacta, near Cusco, is a classic example, a vast, geometrically precise complex of over 700 structures laid out in a grid, resembling a giant, empty storage container or barracks. It was likely a combination of administrative hub, ceremonial centre, and storage depot for taxes collected in kind. The presence of such standardized architecture, hundreds of miles from the capital, is a clear signature of imperial ambition and bureaucratic control, a template the Inca would later see and emulate. A curious and lesser-known detail lies in the Wari approach to the sacred and the afterlife. While they left no written records, their textile art is among the most sophisticated the world has ever seen. In these brilliantly dyed tapestries, often depicting front-facing deities with radiating headdresses holding staffs, scholars see the iconographic precursors to later Inca gods. Even more intriguing is the discovery of what are interpreted as Alu bundles. The Wari, and later cultures, venerated mummified ancestors. Some Wari burials contain not just a single body, but carefully arranged collections of bones from multiple individuals, wrapped in layers of magnificent textiles to form a sacred bundle. These bundles represented the collective, deified ancestors of a community or lineage, the literal and spiritual foundation of their identity and claim to land. This practice suggests that Wari power may have been consolidated not just through roads and garrisons, but by co-opting or integrating the ancestor cults of the peoples they incorporated. Scholars still debate whether the Wari collapse was caused by a prolonged drought, internal rebellion, or simply the overextension of their administrative model. There is evidence of climatic stress in the form of long-term drought cycles that would have crippled the agricultural surplus needed to feed administrative centers and armies. At some sites, there are signs of deliberate ritual closure. At the fortress city of Cerro Baul, a spectacular mesa-top outpost in Moquegua, evidence suggests the Wari did not flee, but held a final, elaborate feast. They brewed massive amounts of chicha beer, smashed the drinking vessels in place, and then set fire to the palace before withdrawing in an orderly manner. This was not a rout, but a ceremonial termination. The empire seems to have contracted back to its core and then fragmented into smaller polities. The roads, while still physically present, lost their unifying purpose. The Wari vanishing is perhaps the most literal example of a civilization becoming a foundation. When the Inca arose centuries later, they encountered the physical remains of Wari roads and ruins. They called these remnants Purun things, from a wild, lawless, prior age. They did not know the name Wari. They saw the infrastructure but not the architects, the shell but not the spirit. The Inca brilliantly adopted and expanded the Wari road network, but the original imperial vision, the specific cosmology encoded in their textiles, and the reason for their rigid compounds faded from memory. The Wari Empire dissolved, leaving its skeleton for another to wear. This pattern of a sophisticated predecessor, being so thoroughly overshadowed that its very identity is lost to its heirs, presents a haunting question. How many other blueprints of power lie buried, their creators anonymous, their achievements credited to those who came after? The Moche lords of the desert. Pyramid-building artists along a fragile coast endured floods and droughts until their ritual centers were abandoned to sand and looters. Along the narrow ribbon of desert that constitutes Peru's northern coast, between the Pacific's cold Humboldt Current and the bone-dry foothills of the Andes, life is dictated by a few river valleys cutting down from the mountains. Here, the Moche people, contemporaries of the early Wari, engineered a hydraulic miracle. From around 100 to 800 CE, they transformed these valleys into fertile garden plots, sustaining a society of extraordinary artistic and architectural achievement. They are best known for their hyper-realistic ceramic portraits, their dazzling goldwork, and their immense adobe pyramids, the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, which still dominate the landscape near Trujillo. The Moche were master storytellers, depicting their world from erotic scenes to intricate surgeries in stunning ceramic detail. Yet, their major ceremonial centers were eventually left to the encroaching sand, their canals silted up, and their political order fragmented, leaving behind not a written history, but a gallery of breathtaking art that speaks of a world in flux. The mainstream anchor for the Moche is the dual pyramid complex in the Moche Valley itself. The Huaca del Sol, a massive tiered platform of over 130 million adobe bricks, was likely an administrative and political center. Across the sandy plain, the Huaca de la Luna, smaller but more intricate, served as the primary ceremonial and religious focus. Excavations at Huaca de la Luna have revealed one of the New World's most vivid and terrifying artistic programs. Multicolored friezes depicting a central fanged deity, now known as the Decapitator, or Ay Apayek, alongside marching warriors, prisoners, and complex mythological scenes. Furthermore, the discovery of the Lord of Sipan's tomb in 1987 provided a Rosetta Stone for understanding Moche elite culture. This unlooted burial, akin to a New World Tutankhamun, contained the remains of a warrior priest in full regalia, golden headdresses, pectorals, turquoise inlaid jewelry, and symbolic weapons, surrounded by sacrificed retainers, wives, and a guardian with amputated feet. It confirmed that the elaborate ritual scenes on their pottery were not mere mythology, but reflections of a highly stratified, theocratic society. A curious and lesser-known detail lies in the evidence of their sophisticated environmental management and its eventual failure. The Moche were not just passive recipients of river water. They built massive, diversion-based canal systems to bring water from the Andean foothills to desert fields. Some canals stretched for dozens of kilometers. However, ice core data from the Quelcaya Glacier and geological studies of flood deposits tell a story of climatic chaos towards the end of their fluorescence. The region was hit by a devastating sequence of a mega drought lasting perhaps 30 years, followed by a period of intense, catastrophic rainfall and flooding from El Niño events. These floods would have washed away fields, silted up canals, and likely triggered landslides in the mountains that dammed and rerouted rivers. One lesser discussed theory points to a specific, poignant discovery. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of attempted reinforcements to temple walls using shikra bags, mesh bags filled with stones, a desperate, ad hoc measure against floodwaters that ultimately proved futile against the scale of the deluges. Scholars still debate whether the final blow was environmental catastrophe, social upheaval, or a combination that shattered the covenant between the Moche lords and their people. The elite, who derived their power from a claimed ability to mediate with the gods for water and fertility, would have faced a profound crisis of legitimacy when the skies withheld rain for a generation, only to then unleash biblical floods. The archaeological record shows that major centers like the Huacas de Moche were not destroyed by war, but were gradually abandoned. There is evidence of later, squatter-like occupation in the shadow of the Great Pyramids by people with a materially poorer culture. This suggests the central authority collapsed, and the population dispersed or reorganized into smaller, more resilient valley communities. The Moche's great artistic tradition ceased. The molds for the famous portrait vessels were no longer used. The vanishing of the Moche political and ceremonial system is a story of a civilization losing its dialogue with a capricious environment. They mastered the desert for centuries, but could not withstand the climate's violent oscillations. Their great pyramids, built of mud brick, began their slow return to the earth from which they were formed. The looters who later tunneled into Huaca del Sol were only accelerating a natural process of dissolution. Yet, the people themselves did not disappear. Their descendants likely persisted in the valleys, and their cultural DNA resurfaced in later cultures like the Chimu. The Moche lords vanished, but their art ensures they are never forgotten. It captures a moment of supreme confidence and profound vulnerability, a reminder that even the most brilliant human order is etched not in stone, but in sand, awaiting the next shift in the wind or the next flood from the mountains, a theme of environmental fragility that will echo elsewhere in our journey. The Nabta Playa stargazers, stone circles raised in what is now deep desert, suggest early sky watchers whose seasonal camps vanished with changing rains. In the heart of the Sahara, in the blistering, hyper-arid expanse of southern Egypt's Nubian desert, there is a flat, dried-up lakebed called Nabta Playa. Today, it is a place of utter desolation, a sea of sand and rock under a relentless sky. But around 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, this was a different world. It was a savanna, a seasonal grassland dotted with acacia trees and intermittent lakes, a magnet for herds of gazelle and the people who hunted them. And here, millennia before the pharaohs rose by the Nile, a group of nomadic pastoralists performed an act that still staggers the imagination. They dragged massive slabs of stone across the landscape and arranged them with deliberate, precise intent. They built a stone circle, alignments, and calendar markers. This complex is the oldest known astronomical observatory in the world, predating Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. Then the rains stopped. The savanna turned to desert, and the people who tracked the stars here packed up their lives and moved on, leaving their silent megaliths as a testament to a sophisticated knowledge born in a green Sahara that time forgot. The mainstream archaeological anchor for Nabta Playa is the site itself, discovered and studied extensively by a team led by Fred Wendorf. The key features are clear and measurable. There is a central calendar circle, a small ring of stones with 4 gates that likely aligned with the summer solstice sunrise and other astronomical events. Radiating out from this are lines of megaliths, and a few hundred meters away, a series of tumuli stone burial mounds. Perhaps most intriguing are the more than 24 complex, sculpted stones, some weighing several tons, that were dragged from bedrock over a kilometer away. These were not haphazard piles. Sediment analysis confirms the playa was an episodic lake, and the campsites surrounding the megaliths contain hearths, tools, and the bones of domesticated cattle. This was a recurring, perhaps annual, gathering place for groups spread across a wide region, a place of ceremony, social consolidation, and celestial observation. A curious and often speculative detail involves the so-called cow stone. Among the sculpted megaliths is one that appears to have been carefully shaped to resemble a bovine form. Given the central economic and likely symbolic importance of cattle to these pastoralists, this stone may have served as a kind of totem or anchor for rituals. Furthermore, some researchers, noting the precise alignments, we have cautiously proposed that the site's geometry may encode knowledge of stellar precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes the position of the stars over a 26,000-year cycle. This is a highly contested claim, pushing the boundaries of mainstream interpretation. It suggests a depth of observational tradition passed down over generations that is astounding for a nomadic society. Whether they understood the mechanics or simply recorded the slow shift in their sky, the implication is of a long-term, stable cultural memory tied to this specific location. Scholars still debate whether the primary function of Nabta Playa was ceremonial, calendrical, or a vital part of a survival strategy in a marginal environment. The dominant and most persuasive theory is practical. It was a sophisticated calendar tied to the arrival of the seasonal monsoon rains. Knowing precisely when the rains would refill, the playa was a matter of life and death. It dictated the movement of herds, the timing of gatherings, and the viability of the season. The stone circle was a communal insurance policy, a way of harmonizing human activity with the cosmic and meteorological cycles. Its construction required cooperation and a shared worldview, implying a level of social organization more complex than typically attributed to simple pastoral nomads. It was a proto-science, born of acute necessity. The vanishing of the Nabta Playa culture is inextricably linked to the vanishing of their world. Around 5000 BCE, the climate of the Sahara began its final, decisive shift towards hyper-aridity. The monsoon belt moved south, the grasslands died, the lakes evaporated, and the desert we know today established its dominion. There was no catastrophe for the people, only a slow, inevitable migration. They followed the retreating rain and the Nile, their knowledge and traditions likely flowing with them into the valley that would become the cradle of pharaonic Egypt. The stones of Nabta Playa were left behind, a skeleton of a once vibrant ritual landscape. Over millennia, the desert sands buried them, preserving them not through human care, but through utter abandonment. Their builders didn't collapse. They simply walked away from a location that had lost its reason for being, leaving a mystery for a far future age to uncover. This is a vanishing of place and context, not necessarily of people. It asks us to consider how much of humanity's earliest intellectual achievement is buried beneath deserts and seas, not because cultures failed, but because they successfully adapted and moved on, leaving their oldest chapters behind. The Guanche Islanders of the Atlantic, mummified burials and cliffside villages on a volcanic archipelago, were overwhelmed by newcomers, leaving only echoes in customs and place names. Out in the Atlantic, where the coast of Africa recedes into a haze of distance, lie the Canary Islands, a chain of volcanic peaks rising from the ocean floor. To the first European sailors arriving in the late Middle Ages, these islands seemed like a fragment of a lost world. They were inhabited by the Guanches, a tall, robust people living in a state of Neolithic technology, isolated from the rest of humanity for perhaps 1,000 years or more. They lived in caves and simple stone houses, herded goats, and practiced a barley-based agriculture. They mummified their dead with techniques hauntingly similar to those of ancient Egypt, and had a society organized under tribal kings. Within a century of sustained European contact, beginning in the early 15th century, their world was obliterated. Their population was decimated by disease, slavery, and war. Their culture systematically dismantled. Their vanishing was not a slow fade, but a brutal, documented collision, leaving behind mummies in hidden caves, enigmatic rock inscriptions, and a ghostly presence in the DNA and folklore of the islands they once had to themselves. The mainstream historical anchor for the Guanche tragedy is the detailed, if biased, account of the Norman and Castilian conquest of the islands, particularly the fierce resistance on Tenerife, which lasted from 1494 to 1496. The final battle of the conquest, at the site of La Victoria de Acentejo, saw the Guanches, armed with stones and wooden spears, overwhelmed by Spanish cavalry, steel, and epidemic diseases to which they had no immunity. The last Menci, or king, of Tenerife, Bentor, according to legend, chose suicide by leaping from a cliff rather than surrender. Following conquest, the surviving Guanches were enslaved, forcibly converted, and their social structures dissolved. Their name itself is a historical simplification, as each island likely had its own distinct tribal identity and dialect, though all shared a common Berber-related origin. The process was so complete that within a few generations, the Guanches as a distinct cultural entity had ceased to exist. A curious and persistent detail lies in the origins of the Guanches themselves and their incredible isolation. Linguistic and genetic studies confirm their ancestors were Berber peoples from North Africa, who likely arrived by boat in the first millennium BCE or CE. How they lost the technology of ocean-going vessels is one of the great puzzles. Once settled, they were trapped by the currents and their own technological regression. They had no boats capable of returning to Africa or even travelling reliably between islands. This created a unique cultural petri dish. Their mummification practices, involving evisceration, desiccation with plant materials, and wrapping in goatskins, developed independently, a fascinating example of parallel cultural evolution. Even more intriguing are the Silbo Gomero, the complex whistled language used on La Gomera to communicate across deep ravines. This is not a Guanche creation, but a later Spanish-era adaptation. However, some researchers cautiously speculate it may have been inspired by or overlaid onto earlier whistled communication systems used by the indigenous people, a last, fading echo of their adaptation to a vertical world. Scholars still debate the extent to which Guanches were wholly eradicated or absorbed. While their culture was dismantled, their genetic legacy is significant. Studies show a substantial proportion of the modern Canarian population, especially on the western islands, carries Guanche mitochondrial DNA. Furthermore, elements of their material culture survived in adapted forms. Their tagora, public meeting circles, influenced village plaza layouts. Their farming techniques persisted, and certain words, particularly for local places and unique geological features, remain. Their true vanishing, therefore, is cultural and political rather than strictly biological. They were not wiped out in a genocide so much as they were dissolved through a rapid and overwhelming process of conquest, disease, and forced assimilation, a pattern that would become grimly familiar in the age of exploration. The story of the Guanches is a stark contrast to the slow environmental or internal declines seen elsewhere. This is a vanishing witnessed and recorded by the very forces that caused it. It represents a specific historical type of disappearance, the end of long-term isolation. For centuries, they had been a living snapshot of a Neolithic North African past, evolving in a unique island environment. The arrival of Europeans was less like contact and more like an asteroid strike from a more technologically advanced world. Their fate underscores a recurring, tragic theme in human history. What happens when a society that has adapted perfectly to its isolated niche is suddenly confronted with a globalizing system it cannot comprehend or resist? The mummies in the caves are not just remains of the dead. They are relics of a whole branch of human experience that was abruptly pruned, leaving only a faint fossilized imprint on the land they once ruled absolutely. The Tarim Basin mummies, well-preserved bodies with distinct clothing and features, rest in desert cemeteries, while the communities that tended them remain largely unidentified. In the stark, arid heart of Asia lies the Tarim Basin, a vast, remote depression in what is now China's Xinjiang region, ringed by some of the world's highest mountains. It is a place of extreme desiccation, a rain-shadowed desert where the very air seems to pull moisture from life. And here, in the blazing heat and saline soil, the dead have been kept in a state of remarkable preservation for millennia. Since the early 20th century, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of burials, most famously at sites like Xiaohe and Kerrihul. The bodies, naturally mummified by the perfect dry, salty conditions, are startling. They wear brightly coloured, finely woven woolen textiles, felt hats, and leather boots. Their faces, with often high noses, deep-set eyes, and light-coloured hair, seem to gaze from a different world. These are the Tarim Basin mummies, dating from roughly 2000 BCE to 200 CE. They speak of a vibrant, sophisticated Bronze Age culture, but one that left no written records and whose language, identity, and ultimate fate are wrapped in layers of mystery as dense as the felt cloaks they were buried in. The mainstream archaeological anchor is the mummies themselves and their grave goods. The beauty of Xiaohe, a female mummy from around 1800 to 1500 BCE, is an icon. She was buried in a felt hat with feathers, a woven woolen cloak, and leather boots. Beside her were a comb, a winnowing tray, and bundles of ephedra twigs, likely for ritual or medicinal purposes. The burials are often in boat-shaped coffins, covered with cattle hides and marked by wooden poles or oars, suggesting a possible symbolic connection to rivers or a journey to the afterlife, an irony in one of the driest places on Earth. The textiles are technologically advanced, featuring twill weaves and intricate patterns that show clear links to broader Eurasian steppe traditions. These were not primitive nomads, but participants in a wide network of trade and technology that moved across the inner deserts of Asia long before the Silk Road was formally established. A curious and politically sensitive detail involves the physical anthropology of the mummies. Their so-called Caucasoid features ignited sensational claims and intense scholarly debate about the peopling of the region. For a time, they were held up as evidence of a lost European or Indo-European tribe deep in China. However, recent comprehensive genomic studies have added profound nuance. The genetic evidence shows the earliest Tarim Basin mummies from the Xiaohe culture were not recent migrants from the West, but a direct, isolated descendant population of an ancient North Eurasian hunter-gatherer group known as the ancient North Eurasians, with significant contributions from a population related to ancient hunter-gatherers from the Iranian plateau. They had no discernible steppe pastoralist, Yamnaya, ancestry, which was a major surprise. They were a unique, local admixture, a deeply rooted population that had likely been in the region for millennia, developing their distinct culture in situ. This genetic isolation makes their material culture, which shows influences from all directions, even more fascinating. Scholars still debate what language these people spoke and how their unique culture eventually dissolved. Were they speakers of a Tocharian language, an extinct branch of Indo-European, known from later manuscripts found in the Tarim Basin? Or did they speak a completely unknown, perhaps Para-Tocharian tongue? Their material culture shows connections to the Afanasyevo culture to the north, the Bimak culture of Central Asia to the west, and even early Chinese cultures to the east. Yet they remained genetically distinct. Their disappearance as a recognizable culture was likely a slow process of absorption and demographic change. Later waves of migrants, first Eastern Iranian-speaking peoples like the Saka, Scythians, and later Turkic peoples moved into the basin. The oasis-dwelling descendants of the mummy makers would have traded, intermarried, and been drawn into new political and linguistic spheres, particularly with the expansion of the Han Chinese and the Xiongnu Confederation. Their unique identity melted into the ethnic stew of the Silk Road. The vanishing of the Tarim Basin mummy culture is a vanishing of genetic and cultural distinctness into the tides of history. They were not conquered in a dramatic campaign. They were slowly woven into a broader tapestry. The mummies themselves are a snapshot of a moment when a particular, isolated group had developed a stunningly preserved material culture perfectly adapted to their harsh environment. Their felt, their wool, their boat coffins were the products of a specific time and a specific genetic lineage. That lineage and its unique cultural expression eventually faded, absorbed by the very trade routes and population movements their existence helps to prove were ancient. They stand as a testament to a profound truth. Long before empires rose and fell, the remote corners of the earth were home to complex, interconnected, and ultimately fragile human experiments whose only witnesses are the perfectly preserved dead. The Etruscan city leagues. Terraced hill cities and elaborate tombs once dominated central Italy, yet their language and myths survive only in fragments quoted by others. The rolling hills of central Italy, between the Tiber and the Arno, hold a particular golden light. In the first millennium BCE, these hills were not the peaceful vineyards of today, but the heartland of a powerful, sophisticated, and mysterious people, the Etruscans. To the Romans, who would eventually absorb them, they were the Etrusi or Tusi, a source of fascination, dread, and cultural borrowing. The Etruscans built fortified cities on easily defensible plateaus, like Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri. They were master metallurgists, producing breathtaking goldwork. They created elaborate, painted tombs that were virtual subterranean homes for the dead, filled with vibrant frescoes of banquets, dancing, and sporting events. They deeply influenced early Rome, contributing symbols of authority like the fasces, religious practices of divination, and perhaps even the city's name. Yet, by the end of the 1st century BCE, their language was extinct, their political independence long crushed, and their unique worldview preserved only in the pages of Roman authors who saw them as a conquered, yet still somewhat mystical, former master. The mainstream historical anchor for the Etruscans is twofold: their spectacular tomb art and their complex relationship with Rome. The Necropoli della Banditaccia at Cerveteri, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is a city of the dead, with streets, squares, and tumuli resembling houses, complete with carved stone furniture. The Tomba degli Auguri, Tomb of the Augurs, or the Tomba della Caccia e della Pesca, Tomb of Hunting and Fishing, at Tarquinia, provide a vivid window into Etruscan life, belief, and their famous joie de vivre. Historically, the last 3 kings of Rome before the Republic were said to be Etruscan, the Tarquin dynasty. Their expulsion in 509 BCE marks a pivotal moment, after which Rome and the Etruscan city-states engaged in centuries of warfare and alliance. The eventual Roman conquest was piecemeal, city by city, culminating in the brutal siege of Veii in 396 BCE. Even after conquest, Etruscan aristocrats served in the Roman Senate, and Etruscan haruspices, soothsayers, were consulted by Roman generals until the end of the empire. Their integration was deep, but it was an integration that demanded the surrender of their cultural core. A curious and linguistically tantalizing detail is the so-called Liber Linteus, the Linen Book of Zagreb. This is the longest extant Etruscan text, but it is not a grand epic or history. It is a liturgical calendar, a list of rituals for specific days and months, written on linen cloth. Ironically, it was preserved not in an Etruscan tomb, but because the linen was later cut up and used in Egypt to wrap a mummy. We have the words, but their precise meaning remains frustratingly opaque, as Etruscan is not fully deciphered. We can read the letters, they used a Greek-derived alphabet, but we understand only a fraction of the vocabulary, mostly from tomb inscriptions and glosses in Roman texts. Furthermore, the unique Etruscan reverence for the liver as the seat of life and the key to divination is exemplified by the Piacenza liver, a bronze model of a sheep's liver inscribed with the names of gods in its sections, used to train haruspices in the art of haruspicy, reading the future in the organs of sacrificed animals. Scholars still debate the origins of the Etruscan people themselves, a debate that has raged since antiquity. Did they, as Herodotus claimed, migrate from Lydia in Anatolia? Or were they, as Dionysius of Halicarnassus argued, an indigenous people who had always been in Italy? Modern genetic studies of ancient Etruscan remains have added fuel to both sides, showing a strong genetic continuity with earlier Iron Age Italic populations, but also signals of contact with the Near East. This suggests they were primarily local, but with a level of contact and influence that made them distinct from their Italic neighbours. Their language, a non-Indo-European isolate in a sea of Italic languages, remains the strongest argument for a complex, perhaps very ancient, origin story that we may never fully unravel. The vanishing of the Etruscans was a centuries-long process of cultural assimilation, a deliberate Roman strategy. After military conquest, Rome extended citizenship to Etruscan elites, drawing them into the Roman political and social machine. Latin replaced Etruscan as the language of power and commerce. The vibrant, colourful Etruscan art style gave way to Hellenistic and then Roman realism. Their religion was formalized and, stripped of its political power, turned into a technical skill in service of the Roman state. By the time the Emperor Claudius, who was fascinated by Etruscan history and wrote a, now lost, 20-volume treatise on them, ruled in the 1st century CE, the language was already a scholarly curiosity. The Etruscans didn't disappear. They became Roman. Their tombs were sealed, their cities rebuilt along Roman lines, and their stories were rewritten by their conquerors. This is a vanishing through successful integration, where a dominant culture so thoroughly absorbs another that the latter's independent voice is silenced, surviving only in the architecture, rituals, and art it donated to its voracious heir, a fate echoing the earlier dissolution of Elam, but played out on the stage of the classical world. The Sogdian caravan lords, traders who once knit together markets from steppe to sea, faded as routes shifted, their merchant colonies absorbed by rising faiths and states. For centuries, the true lords of the Silk Road were not emperors or generals, but a network of merchants from a region known as Sogdiana, centered in the fertile river valleys of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. From their key cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Panjikent, the Sogdians built a commercial empire of the mind and the ledger. They were the indispensable middlemen, the polyglot facilitators who moved goods, ideas, and languages from the court of Tang China to the borders of Byzantium. Their colonies, from the Mongolian steppe to the Chinese heartland, were nodes in a vast, resilient web. They were Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Manichaeans, and Nestorian Christians, often within the same trading family. Yet, by the end of the first millennium, their unique mercantile civilization, once so vibrant that their tongue was the lingua franca of the Silk Road, began to fade. The trade routes they mastered shifted, and the new empires and faiths that rose in their wake, the Arab Caliphate, the Tang dynasty, the Tibetan Empire, ultimately absorbed their once pivotal role, turning the cosmopolitan Sogdian into a historical figure, a ghost in the ledgers of global exchange. The mainstream historical anchor for the Sogdians is their tangible presence far from home. In China, particularly during the Tang dynasty, 7th–10th centuries CE, Sogdian merchant communities were powerful and visible. They are documented in Chinese annals, celebrated in art, and memorialized in their own tomb inscriptions. The tomb of a Sogdian Sabao, caravan leader, in Xi'an, China, discovered in 2003, is a stunning example. Its stone sarcophagus is carved with vivid scenes of caravan life, Zoroastrian fire altars, and Central Asian musicians, a slice of Sogdiana transported to the Chinese capital. Furthermore, the remarkable Ancient Letters, a bundle of Sogdian correspondence from the early 4th century CE, found by Aurel Stein in a Chinese watchtower, to reveal the intimate details of a merchant network in crisis, with one writer pleading for help as his community faced war and banditry. These documents confirm the Sogdians were not just traders, but settlers who maintained deep cultural and familial ties across thousands of miles. A curious and culturally revealing detail is the Sogdian role as cultural translators and artistic innovators. In the ruins of Panji-Kent, a Sogdian city destroyed and abandoned in the 8th century, archaeologists found spectacular murals that are a unique fusion of Iranian, Indian, and Chinese styles. They depict epic cycles, possibly from the Iranian Shahnameh, scenes of feasting, and even a haunting painting of a goddess riding a four-armed monster across a sea of the dead. This artistic synthesis was their stock in trade. Even more intriguing is the story of An-Lushan, the devastatingly powerful Tang general whose rebellion nearly toppled the dynasty in the 8th century. He was of Sogdian and Göktürk origin, a testament to how deeply Sogdians had penetrated the highest echelons of the states they served. Their influence was not just economic, but military and political, making their eventual fading all the more significant. Scholars still debate the primary cause of the Sogdian civilization's decline. Was it the Arab-Muslim conquest of Central Asia in the 7th and 8th centuries, which destroyed Zoroastrian temples and imposed new political structures? Was it the collapse of the unified Tang dynasty after the An-Lushan rebellion, which disrupted the prosperous eastern end of their network? Or was it the gradual, centuries-long shift of major trade routes from the overland Silk Road to the maritime Indian Ocean routes? The answer is likely all three. The Arab conquest did not eliminate the Sogdians, but it began the process of their Islamization and incorporation into a new Persianate Islamic world. Their language, once the tongue of commerce, was gradually replaced by Persian. Their unique syncretic culture was diluted by the more doctrinaire spread of Islam and the reassertion of Persian literary high culture. The vanishing of the Sogdians is perhaps the most subtle of all. They did not collapse. They were rendered obsolete by a changing world system. Their expertise became commonplace. Their colonies were assimilated. Their descendants became Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hui Chinese. The city of Samarkand remained great, but as an Islamic center, not a Sogdian one. Their civilization vanished into the very fabric of Eurasian history, its threads woven so tightly into the tapestry that the original pattern is hard to discern. They were the essential grease in the wheels of Old World exchange, and when those wheels were replaced or began turning to a different rhythm, the grease was absorbed, leaving no separate residue. It is a disappearance of utility and unique identity, a reminder that some of history's most pivotal actors are not those who build enduring monuments of stone, but those who build networks, and networks, however vital, are the first to dissolve when the map is redrawn. The Phoenician Atlantic outposts. Seafaring merchants likely dotted distant coasts with small ports, many of which vanished without leaving more than rumors in later texts. The Phoenicians, the merchant mariners of the ancient Levant, are famed as the founders of Carthage and the purveyors of purple dye and cedar wood across the Mediterranean. But their reach, whispered in classical sources and hinted at by scattered artifacts, may have extended far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, into the fog-shrouded Atlantic. Ancient writers like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus speak of Phoenician voyages to a land of tin in the far north, likely Cornwall, and to islands in the Atlantic, perhaps the Azores or Madeira. They tell of a trade so secretive that Phoenician captains would allegedly run their ships aground to deter followers. The archaeological evidence for permanent settlements beyond Gibraltar is tantalizingly thin, suggesting any outposts were small, seasonal, or transient trading stations. Unlike the robust city-states of the Mediterranean, these Atlantic ventures left footprints in sand and sea spray, vulnerable to being washed away by time, tide, and the rise of rival naval powers who had no interest in preserving their memory. The mainstream anchor for Phoenician seafaring is, of course, their well-documented Mediterranean network. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, and their most famous colony, Carthage, were hubs of commerce and naval power. Their shipbuilding technology, sturdy, rounded hulls powered by sail and oar, was advanced for its time. In the Atlantic, the most concrete evidence comes from the Iberian Peninsula. Sites like Cadiz, ancient Gadir, in southern Spain, were established Phoenician colonies that became wealthy gateways to Atlantic resources. From these secured bases, voyages further north and south were feasible. Archaeological finds, such as Phoenician pottery and the occasional inscription, have been confirmed in Portugal and along the Atlantic coast of Morocco. This proves they were sailing these waters. The leap of faith and the historical mystery concerns how far they ventured and whether they established any lasting presence on the more distant, uninhabited archipelagos of the eastern Atlantic. A curious and fringe-adjacent detail involves the mysterious Phoenician coin hoard allegedly found on the Azores in the 18th century. The story goes that Carthaginian coins were discovered on the island of Corvo. While this anecdote is often cited in speculative literature, it is viewed with extreme skepticism by mainstream academia, as the original coins have been lost and the account is murky. More intriguing, but still controversial, are the Parahyba inscription in Brazil and the Bat Creek stone in Tennessee, artifacts purportedly bearing Phoenician script found in the Americas. These are almost universally dismissed by scholars as hoaxes or misidentifications. They represent the powerful desire to connect these master mariners to a global narrative, but they obscure the more plausible, if less sensational, reality. The Phoenicians were likely cautious, practical traders, not transoceanic colonizers. Their Atlantic presence was probably a fragile web of seasonal contacts with local tribes for tin, amber, and other resources, not a string of mini Carthages. Scholars still debate the extent and nature of Phoenician exploration into the Atlantic Ocean. The consensus is that they certainly reached the British Isles for tin and possibly the Atlantic islands of Madeira and the Canaries. Though evidence for settlement there before the medieval period is scant, the vanishing then is not of a known colony, but of a potential and plausibility. Any small remote outpost they might have established a sheltered cove with a fresh water source used for repairing ships and caching goods would have been exceptionally vulnerable. It could have been wiped out by a storm, abandoned due to shifting trade patterns, or simply forgotten when Carthage was destroyed by Rome in 146 BCE and the Phoenician heartland was absorbed into Hellenistic and later Roman spheres. The knowledge of these distant voyages, passed down orally among sailors, would have dissipated when the specialized maritime culture that sustained it was subsumed. The story of the Phoenician Atlantic outposts is a vanishing of possibility, a fading from the very edge of the known world. It speaks to the fragility of exploration in antiquity. Their legacy in the Atlantic is not one of ruins, but of rumors, the rumors that fueled later Greek and Roman tales of the Fortunate Isles or the Tin Islands. Their possible footprints were washed away by the very ocean they mastered. This contrasts sharply with the solid, tomb-filled vanishings of inland empires. Here, the civilization's farthest frontier simply receded, melting back into the realm of myth because it left no durable imprint on the land. It prompts a haunting thought. How many other first contacts, other tentative probes into the unknown by ancient peoples, have left no trace at all? Their stories lost with the last sailor who made the voyage. As we move next to a civilization that left vast, undeniable stone ruins, but whose end was swift and environmentally dramatic, we shift from a vanishing of whispers back to a vanishing inscribed unmistakably in the earth itself. The Liangzhu jade culture, canal-laced lowland cities, thick with ritual jades, succumbed to sudden flooding, leaving polished artifacts with little voice to explain them. In the watery, low-lying plains surrounding the Yangtze River Delta, near modern Hangzhou, a sophisticated Neolithic culture blossomed over 5,000 years ago. The Liangzhu people, flourishing from around 3,300 to 2,300 BCE, represent what some scholars call China's first state-level society. They were master hydraulic engineers, constructing massive earthen dams and a complex network of canals to control water for agriculture, transport, and defense. At the heart of their culture was a city of perhaps 30,000 people, with a central palatial complex, workshops, and elaborate graves. But their most enduring signature is jade. They carved this incredibly hard stone into exquisite ritual objects, Kong hollow tubes with square outer sections and cylindrical inner cores, biflat discs with a central hole, and axes, all with a supernatural, laser-like precision and a sublime, almost modern aesthetic of simplicity and power. Then, abruptly, their civilization ended. The great city and its satellite towns were abandoned, and the region would not see such concentrated power again for over 1,000 years. The cause appears written not in conquest, but in layers of silt and mud. The mainstream archaeological anchor for Liangzhu is unequivocally the Liangzhu city site and its associated hydraulic system, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Excavations have revealed a city protected by massive, engineered earthen walls with a central Mojiaoshan platform that likely held palatial structures. The scale of public works is staggering. A system of dams in the surrounding hills, some over 10 kilometers long, created reservoirs that managed flooding and irrigated rice paddies. This allowed for a massive agricultural surplus. The society was highly stratified, as seen in its cemeteries. Elite tombs, such as those at Fanshan, contain hundreds of ritual jades, while commoner graves hold few or none. The jades themselves are not ornamental. They are ritual implements, their forms the Kong linking earth, square, and heaven, circle, deeply symbolic of a complex cosmology. The sheer technical skill required to work nephrite jade, using only sand and water as abrasives, speaks of a specialized, dedicated craft priesthood. A curious and telling detail lies in the forensic analysis of the site's demise. Recent geological and sedimentological studies have identified a clear, catastrophic horizon. A thick layer of silt, devoid of human artifacts, directly covers the remains of the Liangzhu cultural layer. This points to a massive, sustained flooding event, likely caused by increased monsoon intensity or a shift in typhoon patterns. Pollen analysis shows a dramatic change from cultivated rice pollen to wild grasses and ferns, indicating the sudden abandonment of agriculture. Intriguingly, some researchers have cautiously linked this event to a broader, global climate anomaly around 4.2 thousand years ago, a period of aridity and instability that affected civilizations from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia and Egypt. For the low-lying, water-managed world of Liangzhu, this climatic shift may have manifested not as drought, but as uncontrollable deluges that overwhelmed their sophisticated dams and canals, turning their greatest strength into their fatal weakness. Scholars still debate whether the flooding was the sole cause or merely the final blow to a society already under stress. Could political fragmentation or social unrest have weakened the centralized authority needed to maintain the massive hydraulic systems, making them more vulnerable to failure? The archaeological record shows no signs of invasion or warfare, no mass graves, no weapons concentrated in destruction layers. The end seems to have been environmental and systemic. After the floods, the region appears to have been largely depopulated for centuries, its people perhaps dispersing to higher ground, their complex social and ritual order impossible to maintain without the agricultural base and the concentrated labor force the water management system enabled. The Liangzhu elite, whose power was vested in controlling water and mediating with the spirits through jade, lost their mandate in the face of a nature they could no longer control. The vanishing of the Liangzhu is a starkly physical one. Their world was literally buried under meters of silt, preserving it but also sealing its fate. The great dams were breached and forgotten. The polished jade Kong and Bai, robbed of their ritual context, became inscrutable treasures for later cultures to find and wonder at. This was not an assimilation or a slow fade, it was a geological termination. The civilization did not transform, it was switched off. Its people survived, but their unique political and cultural achievement did not. Liangzhu stands as a powerful reminder that some of humanity's earliest and most brilliant experiments in social complexity were exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge of environmental stability. When that balance was lost, the entire intricate structure canals, palaces, jade workshops, social hierarchies could vanish beneath the mud, leaving only ghosts of green stone to hint at a lost world of order and belief. This narrative of environmental fragility brings us full circle, echoing the Moche's struggle with their coastal deserts and floods, but on a different continent and with a different, yet equally definitive, outcome. The Jomon forest ancestors, potters and foragers, lived for millennia among forests and coasts, then yielded ground to new farmers whose stories largely overwrote their own. For over 10,000 years, long before rice paddies defined the Japanese landscape, a different Japan existed. This was the world of the Jomon, a culture not of farmers, but of sophisticated foragers, fishers, and hunters. Their name, given by later archaeologists, comes from the cord-marked patterns pressed into their pottery, some of the oldest ceramic vessels in the world. They lived in semi-permanent pit dwellings, from the subtropical islands of Okinawa to the northern reaches of Hokkaido, adapting brilliantly to a diverse archipelago. They created astonishingly expressive clay figurines known as dogu, with large, goggled eyes and elaborate patterns, and fashioned intricate lacquerware. Their middens, giant shell mounds containing the debris of daily life, reveal a rich, stable relationship with their environment. Then, around 1000 BCE, a new wave of people, the Yayoi, arrived from the Korean peninsula, bringing wet rice agriculture and metallurgy. The Jomon did not vanish overnight, but over centuries, their way of life, their genetic signature, and their cultural dominance receded, absorbed, and marginalized by the new, expansive agricultural society whose descendants would write the first histories of Japan, in which the Jomon appear only as mythical, wild predecessors. The mainstream archaeological anchor for the Jomon is their incredibly long and rich material record, spanning from roughly 14,000 to 300 BCE. Key sites like Sanai Maruyama in Aomori Prefecture reveal a large, complex settlement with longhouses, storage pits, and evidence of trade over long distances, challenging old notions of foragers as simple nomads. Their pottery is not merely functional, but often spectacularly ornate, evolving through numerous stylistic phases over millennia. The dogu figurines, found broken and deposited in ways suggesting ritual use, are one of the world's great prehistoric art forms. Furthermore, genetic studies confirm the Jomon represent a distinct lineage, separate from the later Yayoi migrants. They are the foundational population of the Japanese archipelago, with their genetic contribution remaining strongest in the indigenous Ainu people of Hokkaido and the Ryukyuan people of Okinawa, who maintain Jomon-like cultural patterns into the modern era. A curious and lesser-known detail involves the potential complexity of Jomon spirituality and social organization. Some of the largest ceremonial sites, like the stone circles at Oyu in Akita, suggest communal rituals that could have integrated widely scattered bands. Analysis of Jomon teeth shows little sign of the dietary stress common in early agricultural societies, indicating their foraging lifestyle was, for millennia, remarkably successful and healthy. Intriguingly, there is a fringe but fascinating theory, based on skeletal and artifact analysis, that some late Jomon communities in eastern Japan may have practiced a very low-level, supplemental form of plant cultivation or management of chestnut and other nut trees, blurring the line between foraging and farming. This suggests they were not static, but dynamically adapting to their environment in complex ways that we are only beginning to understand. Their world was not one of scarcity, but of perceived abundance managed through deep ecological knowledge and ritual. Scholars still debate the nature of the interaction between the Jomon and the incoming Yayoi. Was it violent displacement, peaceful trade and intermarriage, or a slow process of the farmers outcompeting the foragers for the most fertile land? The evidence points to a mix. In some areas, like Western Japan, the transition appears rapid, with Jomon material culture quickly replaced by Yayoi styles, suggesting a significant influx of people. In eastern and northern Japan, the Jomon tradition persisted much longer, and there is clear evidence of cultural exchange and mixture. Jomon pottery styles sometimes appear in early Yayoi sites, and Yayoi rice agriculture was eventually adopted by some Jomon communities. But the overarching trend was clear. The agricultural package, with its ability to support higher, denser populations and its new social hierarchies, was transformative. The Jomon way of life, based on a different relationship with the forest and sea, became economically and politically marginal. The vanishing of the Jomon as the dominant cultural force is a vanishing of a paradigm. They did not go extinct. They were gradually enveloped by a new mode of existence. Their stories, their myths, their specific understanding of a world alive with spirits, a concept that may have deeply influenced later Shinto beliefs, were not recorded by the literate states that emerged from the Yayoi and Kofun periods. They became the other, the Emishi, or hairy people, of later Japanese chronicles, sometimes romanticized, often vilified as primitive. Their incredible longevity, thriving through climatic shifts that would topple empires, stands as a testament to a sustainable, resilient way of life. Yet, it was a way of life that could not withstand the demographic and political engine of intensive agriculture. Their disappearance is the oldest and perhaps most fundamental story of them all. The slow, uneven, but ultimately decisive global shift from foraging to farming, where the older, rooted knowledge of place yields, not always peacefully, to the new, transformative power of the sown seed and the stored surplus. The Dilmun traders' harbours, a fabled land where the sun rises, prospered on Gulf sea lanes, its ports later silted up as its very location became a scholarly puzzle. In the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, Dilmun was a name spoken with reverence and desire. It was described as a pure, sacred land, a place where the sun rises, a paradise where sickness and death held no sway. For the Sumerians and Babylonians, it was also a very real trading partner, a crucial entrepot in the Persian Gulf that brought them the treasures of distant lands. Copper from Oman, carnelian from the Indus Valley, ivory, gold, and exotic woods. Dilmun's merchants were the middlemen of the early Bronze Age, their ships bridging the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus. The heart of this legendary realm is now widely identified with the islands of Bahrain and the adjacent coast of eastern Arabia. Here, archaeologists have found vast necropolises with tens of thousands of burial mounds and the ruins of a major port city. Yet, by the middle of the first millennium BCE, Dilmun's star had waned. Its harbours silted up, its political independence evaporated, and its name faded from contemporary records, retreating from history back into the realm of myth, its physical reality becoming a subject of centuries-long scholarly detective work. The mainstream archaeological anchor for Dilmun is the site of Qalat al-Bahrain, the Bahrain Fort, a tell containing layered cities dating from 2300 BCE to the 16th century CE. Excavations here have revealed a planned, walled port city with warehouses, temples, and residential quarters, fitting the description of a major trading hub. The most iconic Dilmun features are the vast fields of burial mounds, particularly the clusters at Ali. These are not the graves of nomads, but of a settled, wealthy population. Some are royal mounds, dramatically larger than the rest, suggesting a stratified society. Furthermore, Dilmun's distinctive stamp seals, with their elegant, minimalist designs of animals, humans, and geometric patterns, have been found from Mesopotamia to the Indus, providing physical proof of their far-flung commercial connections. The discovery of a Mesopotamian inscription at Qalat al-Bahrain, mentioning the governor of Dilmun, confirms the identification and the site's importance in the second millennium BCE. A curious and persistent mystery surrounds the Aish, the so-called mystery mounds of Bahrain. Scattered across the island are low, oblong mounds of burned, ashy soil and fragmented pottery. For years, their purpose was unknown. Were they industrial sites? Cremation pyres? Recent excavations suggest they may have been part of a large-scale, specialized agricultural process, possibly for date cultivation or even pearl oyster processing, industries that would have supported the trading economy. Another lesser-known but fascinating detail is the evidence of Dilmun's own freshwater sources. In a region of salt water, Dilmun was famed in Mesopotamian texts for its sweet-water springs, both on land and, miraculously, bubbling up from the sea floor, a phenomenon still observed today. This access to fresh water in the midst of a saline sea would have been a critical advantage, turning Bahrain into a vital resupply point for long-distance voyages, making its eventual silting and decline all the more consequential. Scholars still debate the precise causes of Dilmun's decline as an independent mercantile power. The rise of direct sea trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, bypassing the middleman, likely eroded its economic raison d'être. More concretely, environmental change played a role. The silting of its harbours, a process that affects many ancient ports, would have gradually made access for deep-drafted trading vessels difficult, if not impossible. Concurrently, new political forces emerged. The region was absorbed first into the sphere of the Middle Assyrian Empire, then later came under the control of the Neo-Babylonian and, decisively, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Dilmun lost its political autonomy and became a satrapy, a province. Its unique cultural signature, the distinctive seals, the specific burial rites slowly disappeared, assimilated into the broader material culture of the Persian Gulf under imperial rule. The vanishing of Dilmun, therefore, is a compound one. Its economic purpose was made obsolete by changing trade routes. Its physical infrastructure was choked by silt. Its political identity was dissolved into an empire. The paradise, described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a land of immortality and purity, proved to be as mortal as the civilizations that traded with it. Its great burial fields became silent hills, its harbours transformed into dry land. For centuries, the location of Dilmun itself was a mystery, debated by historians who scoured classical texts. It was archaeology that resurrected it from myth, turning a legendary sunrise land back into a mapped and excavated reality. Dilmun's end reminds us that even the most pivotal commercial hubs, the invisible engines of early globalization, are vulnerable to the twin tides of geological change and geopolitical shift. Its story is a fitting final note in our exploration. A civilization that once connected worlds ultimately became disconnected from the flow of history itself. Its name kept alive not by its descendants, but by the poetry of its former customers, a whispered memory of a lost paradise of commerce. Conclusion. Our journey across millennia and continents ends not with a single theory, but with a deeper appreciation for the silence that follows civilization's final act. We have stood in rooftop cities emptied by quiet choice, and in flood-silted metropolises terminated by nature's fury. We have seen languages fade into the ledgers of conquerors, and trading networks dissolve into the very routes they charted. Each story is unique, a product of environment, ingenuity, and circumstance. Yet together, they form a mosaic of human fragility and adaptation. These vanishings challenge the simplistic notion of a linear, upward march of history. Instead, they reveal a landscape of experiments, some lasting millennia, others mere centuries, each testing different answers to the eternal questions of how to live together, worship, trade, and survive. Their ends were not failures in a moral sense, but conclusions to specific chapters. Some societies transformed so completely they became unrecognizable to their former selves. Others dispersed, their people carrying fragments of their world into new futures. The modern curiosity that drives us to uncover these lost worlds is, perhaps, a recognition of our own precarious moment. We see in their abandoned plazas and silent observatories a reflection of our own civilizations, just as brilliant, just as contingent. The past does not whisper warnings so much as it offers a sobering perspective. The endpoints of human endeavor are manifold. To study these vanishings is not to indulge in gloom, but to expand our understanding of what it means to be human, to build, to belong, and ultimately to let go. The true legacy of these 15 lost civilizations lies not in the mystery of their endings, but in the profound, echoing fact of their existence. They remind us that history is not merely the story of what survives, but a vast, quiet cemetery of what once was, each stone a world entire.